Yes, hello again, my audience. So today I have decided to make another video on the history of another group of Asian people, the Chinese. This is my take on their history. It is quite long, as you could expect. These Chinese have been around quite a long time. There are many documentaries on the history of China around on YouTube, but they do not focus on what actually makes the Chinese so Chinese. They are very focused on, the facts. When this emperor was ruling and how many concubines he have and which dynasty he was. But to me, this information is not particularly important. I have more important questions that I want to try and ask, such as, why is China so China? Why does China like rice? Why does China so good? And manufacturing things. Why so China good, apparently, at exams? This last one I think is quite interesting, and I'll tell you why. Because doing exams and making goods is what China has been doing for over 2,000 years, largely uninterrupted by societal collapse, They never had anything that what Europe had, Europe and the rest of the world, there was the Roman Empire that, introduced law and order to the barbarian tribes. But, that was maybe only for, a few hundred years, a few centuries. It was enough to sort of introduce them to this orderly culture, but after that, there was a collapse and dark age. There was no literature, no nothing. And basically, Western civilization had to start again from scratch. And China never had this. They never had this type of collapse. So, why do I study the ancient histories of countries and peoples? Because, honestly, it allows me to more easily understand these peoples, their governments, their politics, their beliefs, their culture, and the conditions that create these social systems. Knowing how these ideas form in different civilizations allow me to better understand how they form in Western civilization and the conditions that ensure their continuation or their demise. You see, the history of man, it's very complex. It is not just man's conscious actions, it is his mindset, his culture, his unconscious decisions, superstitions, how and where he get his food, how he like his women, where he get his women. His accent is shaped by languages inherited from ancestors, both local and foreign, by weather and climate, whether he must struggle to survive in an unforgiving landscape, like the more northern areas of Europe, strictly obeying the mercurial hand of God and nature, having to store up his harvests for the next year, or if he can go and pick fruit from the forest all year long and live carefree existence. I think this is the most puzzling thing about man, not that he is different, but why he is not the same. Knowledge about Chinese history, isn't that important. I said this before. It doesn't really matter the exact dates of emperors during the Qing, Ming, or Ding dynasties. This is all uniform. It is bland and useless information. The first and last emperors of these dynasties is more important than the ones in between. Why the dynasty collapsed, which dynasty replaced it, and why is more important. What decisions led to the collapse, also very important. A great deal of what shapes the culture and peoples of China today is the ideas propagated by the disciples of Confucius from 400 BC onward. You see, during my research here, I have been reading quite a few books, and these books, they don't tend to discuss so much what makes the Chinese people the Chinese. But if you go back into the more prehistoric books, such as one by Arthur de Gobineau, the original CEO of racial differentiation, in his book called The Inequality of the Human Races, published in 1853. He states one thing that is clear about the Chinese is their uniformity. He partially attributes this uniformity to the availability of books and education in China at a fraction of the price in France in the 19th century, meaning even the lower classes would achieve a relatively high level of education. This did not exist in any European nation at the time, you see. Education was largely restricted to those who could afford it, such as the upper classes and maybe the more rich middle classes, such as the traders and the affluent farmers. He contrasts this with the Roman world, in which tectonic shifts of government occurred frequently. Property, religion, and family structure were often called into question. There was actually not that much uniformity of thought in the Roman Empire. Everyone thought differently and wanted to implement their ideas. Novel theories, they were often put into practice, such as Augustus' bachelor tax in the 1st century CE to try and address the declining birth rates in the Roman Empire. But nothing in the Roman world rested on a solid foundation, not even the unity of empire, which was constantly at the risk of fragmentation. One of Gobineau's key theories is that the mixing of races, especially the mixing of the conquered and the conqueror, is a major contributor to the decline of civilizations. That is the spirit of the dominating conqueror often assimilates with the weaker, subservient that of the conquered, and leads to a general weakening in the new civilization or empire that has been achieved. In the case of China, this is undoubtedly true, but is restricted to dynasty rather than civilization itself. For example, the Mongols successfully conquered China in the early 1200s. They did it quite quickly. But in the case of the Yuan dynasty that they established, it was very short-lived. And one of the reasons for its decline was the embrace of Chinese culture by the Mongol Khans, or the perception thereof. And it was perceived to be decadent and hedonistic by the Mongol states and their armies, resulting in their withdrawal of support for the dynasty. The Mongols were sapped of their vitality by those that they conquered. A similar weakening happened with the Manchurian Qing dynasty. Actually, this one, this King or Qing, it confused me very often, but there's Qing. This was the last imperial dynasty of China, lasting until the early 1900s. So, until the Communist Cultural Revolution in 1966, China had never collectively undergone any major cultural or societal shift, or any alteration in the outward forms of power. Of course, the Cultural Revolution during the 20th century was an objective disaster, succeeding in killing millions of citizens and intellectuals and destroying large amounts of valuable Chinese heritage. But, generally speaking, the communist reforms by the Chinese leadership were unsuccessful. Another one that jumps to mind is the Great Leap Forward, absolute disaster. Yes, we will turn our plow and shovels into high-grade steel for machinery without real expertise on smelting. Oh, no, wait, now we cannot make the food for the eating. Also, let's kill all natural predators of insect, like the bird that happen to eat a small amount of our crop seed. Oh no, now the insect is out of control. What shall we do? We shall all starve. Another one I can think of, one-child policy. Oh, why do we have a shortage of girls? I think the list goes on. Some of these reforms maybe originated from a small grain of a good idea. Like stopping foot binding of young girls, but China was generally too large to implement these initiatives efficiently in a short period of time. I should also point out that many of the communist leadership, they were not university educated. They did not really know how the world worked and how such reforms could be implemented successfully. I managed to find a good website. Actually, I will put this one up for you to have a look at. It listed many of the major reforms. For example, the health reforms of the communist regimes in the, I think, 50s and 60s. They had patriotic health movements. This is where basic hygiene and health stuff, don't rub dirt in the wounds, and don't gather the water where you shit, and these kind of things here. I think they also sent to the villages people that had achieved a basic education in a medical training to provide medical care for the villagers. They also had a strict policy for opium addicts, but in general, the level of healthcare during the Great Leap Forward in terms of the more difficult aspects of healthcare went down significantly. They thought that they should have the doctors mopping the floors occasionally to assist and to give their doctor appreciation of the so-called dignity of work. But yes, there was, if we look at the education as well, so the level of low education, you could say, of the very basic education increased. But the quality of the education overall, the higher education, went down. In fact, if you had the university degree, you were despised. And, I think this is all very funny because how stupid would you have to be to think that you can implement any kind of big infrastructure or reform without having someone who at least has researched how these things should be implemented in the past. But anyway, look, we are not here to discuss China communism. I just want to support Governor's statement there that China is in general very bad at the large, widespread reforms. So, I want to take a holistic approach looking at Chinese history. This word holistic, it is very good buzzword. You see it very often in the marketing and these kind of people who want to shill you stuff to buy. It's kind of shit like health plans and diets, or it will give you a holistic look. But actually, this holistic word, it just means overall, all-encompassing look, So as always, with every civilization, I think it is good to look back to hunter-gatherer because it shows us many interesting things. One of these things it shows us that is very interesting is how the hunter-gatherer was better nourished than the farmers that came afterward. Excuse me. Yes, but first we shall take a look at the Chinese climate. I haven't actually been to China, actually. It's a big place, not just like a dirty, smog-filled Beijing. It is big like United States. There is big variation in climate from north to south and from east to west. Just looking at the map of China, you can see that more than half of the country is sandy color. So what does this mean? Well, it means it's a shit place for growing crops, and it's bad for rice, and it's bad for China. But like many places, China climate has not always been like it is today. From 8,000 to 3,000 BC, climate several degrees warmer in the north and northwest areas, and also a much more moist. From 3,000 to 1,000 BC, this was the time when the climate cooled and became drier like it is today. So somewhere around 10,000 to 5,000 BC, peoples in China began to settle in sedentary farming villages. Generally, it is agreed by anthropologists that transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer resulted in less vitality of the peoples, more dental cavities, malnourishment, shrieking stature, etc. I think it is important to note that we as humans, we thrive most when we have a very varied diet, with many different kinds of meat and wild vegetable and this sort of stuff. But I think ultimately back in this time, the primary source of energy was probably from the hunted game, the animal fat and the animal protein. I think this is what is responsible for our large and complex brains. Actually, the brain, is 70% fat by dry mass, and it is not canola oil fat. No, it is omega-3 fat. So keep this in mind if you are looking for more healthy options. Stop eating these empty carbohydrates like pasta and rice, white rice, and this sort of stuff, and eat more meat. But yes, anyway, so there might be a lot of Paleolithic and earlier cultures in China that died out or assimilated. Yeah, it's possible, but like I always say, pictures or it didn't happen. If there's not record or settlement, it's impossible to know. Also, the plains of China, they have been farmed and plowed for millennia. And I would say probably many artifacts are lost in this way. They get pulled up by plow and the farmer, throw them away or burn them, So if we start with what is recognized as one of the first kind of organized cultures of China, the culture that we have record of, we find the village. We start with the Yan Shao. These guys were living near the Yalu River, and this is around the northern half of China. Central plains, like this, they probably existed from about 5000 BC to 3000 BC. And, overall, climate considered, this was good time to exist. It was known as the Holocene optimum. North China was warm and humid, excellent for vegetation, wild game, and primitive agriculture. These guys, they did not grow rice, actually, up north, because it was not really suitable for rice up there. They grow millet. Now I think they grow many different things like sorghum and soybean and wheat and barley, but generally not good climate for rice. It's not warm enough. So these Yan Shao guys, they about half the calories were from this thing called millet. But they supplemented the rest of their diet with wild game and plants. They had a domesticated dog, pig, and few cattle, sheep, and goat. Tools were stone, of course. There was some bronze, but not enough to write home about, to be honest. The Liangsha, they liked their slash and burn agriculture. Villages had basic wattle daub hut. This is like mud and stick, basically. And they were about maybe 10 acres, which to visualize 10 acres, I find this is helpful for me. About 200 by 200 meters, like this, which I think maybe 600 feet if you are a vulgar American. And these villages inhabited only so long as the fields were fertile. So, probably maybe 5 years, maybe a few years. And as long as the game abounded, and when the land was not so good anymore, they would abandon. So one of the ways they find out about the wealth and the structure of these civilizations is they look at the burials. They look to see, okay, what was this guy buried with? Was he buried with, 10,000 terracotta warriors like that guy later on? Or were they buried with, a few, colored pebbles and a fucking bone comb? This is fairly important. And then they also look at, okay, well, does he have one little pebble and, maybe one comb, or does he have, 10 combs and many colored pebbles? Well, then maybe he was rich, maybe he was chief, something like this, In general, these burials around this time indicate a fairly basic social structure. So there was probably maybe like a chief, a leader, and that was it. There was no real structure above that. So, very egalitarian. I'm sure the liberals, the communists of today would approve of this civilization, yes. So then around 3000 BC, the Yangshao villages, they begin to go into decline as the climate begins to change. And the Longshan culture appears. So it's probably likely that the Yangshao were incorporated into the Longshan society rather than, say, outright exterminated or chased off, according to the archaeologists. I haven't looked too far into this. I will take their word for it. But, around this time, around 3000 to 2000 BC, the marshes in the northern part of China, they began to dry up. So the Longshan dominates from 3000 to 2000 BC. And of course, they see from the burials that the social stratification had increased from the increasingly elaborate, burials of few people, meaning they were important. But also they see increase in violence, evidence of warfare. And actually, interestingly enough, I did not know this in China, but they were also quite into the human sacrifice. Which, interestingly enough, is not as common as you would think in Europe. But yes, the human sacrifice was relatively common for the Chinese. So how did they know about the warfare, though? This is a good question too, because the settlements, the later settlements of these Longshan, they had the big earth walls. They had the rammed earth walls, which I think were basically wooden. They would have the earth, and it would be encased with wood. And in some of these settlements, the walls were relatively high, 6 meters high and 9 meters wide. So, decent kind of walls, good ramparts to, get pointy stick and poke people when they try to climb the walls. So the remains from the Longshan villages showed declining health, obviously, as they begin to rely more on the eating of the empty carbs. Millet, it really isn't very nutritious. Generally, the Langsha were several inches shorter than Yangsha peoples. They had a higher incidence of dental cavities, anemia, this one where you don't get enough iron for your blood. You need to, it's actually, iron, like metal iron. You need to get a little bit of that in your diet. And their bone structure become weaker. So as the climate changed, there was less Bambi around, but also villages become bigger. There are more people, so more people probably mean less wild game. Last I checked, they didn't have good sanitation either, so more people meant more disease. So what do we get out of this summary of Neolithic Bronze Age China? Well, not a whole lot. You can't really learn a lot about the Chinese of today from the Bronze Age guys. They're obviously quite different. We can see that the climate has changed, but the Han people, they originate in northern China. Written language made after, say, 2000 BC. So actually, relatively speaking, compared to the Middle East, the Levant, these ancient guys like Sumeria, ancient Egypt, they were actually considerably more advanced than the ancient Chinese. Yes, and we know that high carb diets make you sickly, short, and stupid. So make sure you get your meat in your diet. Okay, it's good for your brain. But I think I will leave that here for today. That is 20 minutes. I will continue to do my research. It's not very quick, unfortunately, to give you the wisdom that I am trying to impart. It's not as simple as, reading one book. I have to read several books. Sometimes I find good advice in other places. Yes. Yes, anyway, okay, goodbye.